Hey everyone, welcome to National Quilter Circle Live event. I'm Nikki LaFoyle and I'd like to thank Andrea Smith for joining us today. Hello, Andrea.
Hello.
Now, before we dive right in, Andrea is here today to talk about the new Quilt Block challenge that she designed for NQC. And I'd like to encourage everyone to sign up to start receiving instructions and materials. There should be a link below the video, or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, in the video description. And the challenge begins September 7th, so you still have some time to gather materials and everything. But do sign up, and so you can look over the instructions and materials. And Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about this project, about the quilt, and how you designed it and your inspiration?
So if you haven't joined yet, this will be the quilt that we'll be making. You can't see all of it, but once you download the fabric requirements, you'll get the cover photo, which will show you what the quilt looks like. And you'll get the fabric amounts and then also a coloring sheet so that you can color in your colors so that everybody can see or you can decide which colors go where, if you like that or not. What kind of inspired me, if you can tell, is kind of mountains and stars. I basically started out with the center stars because I wanted to do a big star in the center. And a lot of you have requested rectangular quilts instead of square quilts because I tend to do sampler quilts for the National Cultural Circle and they end up being square. So I wanted to try to do a rectangular design for you guys. So I went from the stars and just kind of wanted to echo them out, and I ended up with mountains. So I thought mountains and stars would be really cool together. And so you're going to download your fabric requirements first to join. And you want to join because then you'll get weekly reminders of, okay, the next block is ready for you guys to make. On these, we'll also have basic instructions where you can test your 1/4 inch scant seam, and it basically gives you tips about the pattern. And it also tells you what fabrics I used for my quilt. If you love these the colors in mine, you know which Kona cottons I used. I like to design beginner-friendly, adventurous beginner-friendly quilts so that everybody can join in. So this quilt is fairly easy. It might look a little complicated, but once you start making it, it's fairly easy. Each week, I will jump on the National Quilter Circle, the NQC Block Challenge Facebook group, and go over the current block. So that way, if you have any questions about that block, you can jump on that live and say, hey, I don't understand this directions, and I can go over that step, and hopefully that'll answer anyone's questions.
People get instructions, but they also will get a lot of guidance from you and from the Facebook group, which there should be a link to join that Facebook group if you haven't already. There'll be a link in the comments or in the description of the video somewhere, so you can find and join that group, which is a great way to connect with other people who are doing the same project. And of course, you who will have probably the best advice for people who are doing your project. So it's a great way to, be part of the community and to, go along the stages of this project together. So it's great that you mentioned that it's an adventurous beginner project, which I like that description. So it's beginner, but also kind of pushing a little bit your skills. So what kind of skills or maybe specialty presser feet? Do people need anything like that to get started? Or if someone hasn't really quilted before, could they just kind of jump in with what they have in their sewing room?
Yeah, you can jump in if you're just a beginner and you've never made a quilt before. The only reason I say adventurous beginner is because most beginners just start out with squares or rectangulars, or even half square triangle. Those are the easiest to start out with. This one does have flying geese in it, and it also has the square and square type blocks, which those might be a little scary for beginners, but they're not hard at all. So I'll walk you through those steps so that you guys will be like, okay, it's not that bad. You can do it. Yeah, definitely. I know there's no really special feet that you need. I do have a 1/4 inch foot that has like a guide on it so that I can just line my fabric up to it. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, that's fine. You can either like mark it on your machine, and some machines, their needle can move back and forth so that you can make sure you have that 1/4 inch scant seam. A scant is actually a little different than a 1/4 inch. It's just a thread width, your needle width smaller than a 1/4 inch, because when you open up that fabric, you're taking up a little bit of fabric. And so you want to make sure, and in the directions, I do tell you how to do that. And it's basically you take three 2-inch wide strips, sew them together, or actually 2.5-inch wide strips, sew them all three together. That center strip will end up being exactly 2 inches wide. And so you want to make sure you do that so that all your blocks will line up correctly when you go, you have all of them done. You want them to end up being all the correct size.
Okay. And we had a question come in about a 1/4 inch foot. So Teresa asks, I have a 1/4 inch foot for my older Singer machine. Will this do the scant quarter seam that is needed for this challenge? Thanks, love the design. So you kind of answered that.
Yeah, it may work. I would definitely do the test to make sure it works. If it doesn't, you could see, okay, it's a little big. You might be able to move your needle one way or the other to make it work for you. But yeah, I would definitely try it out.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. And I love the colors that you chose for this. You're calling it the Starlight Mountains quilt, which is very apt. I love the colors, but one thing that kind of scares me when I'm jumping into a project, and I'm a beginner quilter myself, so choosing the colors to go in the quilt, choosing the colors that will all go together. I like what you have chosen here, but for people maybe who don't have those exact colors, who might not be able to go out and buy them, do you have any advice for putting together colors in this quilt?
I do definitely recommend using the coloring sheet. Say you have a bunch of yardage at home and say, will this look good together? Just grab your colored pencils or crayons, whatever you have lying around, and try to work it out. I actually am trying to use my stash for the one that I'm making with the group. And so I only ordered 2 colors. I'm going to try to go with these. I'm going to do a scrappy version so that I can use up my stash. And I know a lot of you that are going to be joining will just be using your stash. So they're not all yard amounts. They're just like scraps of Kona cottons that I've had used in the past. I ordered orange and yellow because I kind of wanted a bright pop. But I'm going to just do each block a little different. So each of these large stars are going to be different. All the little stars are going to be different. Each one's probably going to be a different color. I would recommend having your background, the D color is your background color. So I'd recommend having that contrast all the other colors just so your stars and your mountains do pop. But definitely draw it out. See if you like it that way. And if it's like, ooh, those don't look good together, try something else.
Yeah, that's nice to have that coloring sheet so that you can get a visual of what it looks like before you start jumping in and cutting out fabric. So that's great to have that included. And we have a question here. Do you have yardage for different size quilts? So is that something that's provided?
No. So I only have the yardage listed for the throw size, but in the Facebook group, I did post graphics or diagrams, not diagrams, a graphic for a twin, a queen, and a king. And those are just basically suggested layouts if you do want to make your quilt larger. Because I got several questions of people wanting to make a king size or a queen size. I know sometimes you're like, how would I do that? So I just wanted to provide those pictures of what it would look like. And I also listed the amount of blocks you would need for each of those sizes, but I don't have the yardage. So I would recommend, like, if you're doing a queen, maybe double the yardage that you're doing for the throw. Just make sure you have a lot on hand, or go scrappy. Just say, I have a bunch of blues. All the blues, I'm gonna like. I have a bunch of different blue florals. Use them all, for that one main color. Um,
Okay.
so you're just gonna have to work with that. Sorry.
No, that's good. Um, Now for the design of this quilt, I'm interested in how, like, your process for that. How do you go about designing a quilt? Like, I know you said your inspiration came from, that initial star and then having the mountains above it. But when you go to design a quilt, do you start with like one block and sketch it out, or do you have like an idea in your mind and then kind of draw it out? How does that go?
Sometimes I'll like have an idea in my head, and I take graph paper and I will work on the graph paper, because then, anything that's on graph paper you can basically turn into a quilt, because it's all made up of triangles and squares. And so
Mhm.
that's usually where I'll start. I'll just draw out a design, and sometimes I'll alter it. Like this one I altered. At first the mountains were a little different, and until you tweak it until you get exactly what you want.
Nice. Um, and going off of our last question, I think about colors, Terry asks, do you have tips for using non-solids like florals? So maybe combining some patterned material with solids in a quilt and how that kind of works together?
um I used to just do all print fabric because I thought solids were boring. And then I signed up for Instagram, and I saw how people used more of solids with their prints, and it really helps those prints pop and the design pop if you mix the solids with your florals. So sometimes I'll take a floral or a print, and I have a Kona cotton card which has all the different Kona colors, and I'll take that and I'll match it up to this floral, and I'll say, okay, these ones go with. Or you can even take a couple florals or couple prints and mix it in with some solids. If you just have like prints that are color on color, that aren't like from a distance it looks like a solid, I think that will make your quilt not that busy. But if you have a ton of just like a bunch of florals, it could look busy. But if you like that, go for it. There's no quilt police here. Like, if you really like those fabrics together and you look at them from a distance and you say, okay, I like those, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've mentioned Kona a couple times. So Kona does, is it organic cotton? And why do you like Kona?
I don't think it's not organic cotton. It's Robert Kaufman Fabrics. I like it because they have like 360 different shades. So like these are all Kona cottons, and I just stick to the one brand because I do have the card, and I can match it up to any other line like Art Gallery, and I just match it up, and I can get solids for backings or for bindings, or
Mhm.
for background fabrics, because most of the background fabrics I like to have a solid, just so that your eye has something to rest on, so that it's not just
Right,
like all prints.
right. Nice. Yeah, that's good to have a lot of choices for colors, I imagine.
Well, and then
Um,
also I can order online too. Like if I have that card, I can just easily order online, because we don't have a local quilt shop here in Gig Harbor. Um, and so I would have to like go to Tacoma or Seattle. And so online ordering is where it's at right now.
Absolutely, for sure, right now. And that's nice. So you have a card so you can see what you're getting, because sometimes the image on the screen of the color is a little bit different than what comes to you. So if you can see it, you know what you're getting, then it's a lot easier to order, for
Yeah,
sure.
and I think there's other like Bella solids, and um I think other people produce cards. I just don't have them.
Okay, nice. A question just came in about thread and threads for the project. Denise asks, did you change your thread as you sewed, or did you use a neutral thread for the entire project?
I typically will just use a neutral thread the whole time. During piecing, I always use white or a cream. If like if I have a white in the quilt, I'll just use white. Even though I do have dark navies, I just use white. It's just when you go to iron it, don't pull your pieces when you iron. Just kind of finger press them open and then press them. Then you won't see the thread. I know if you're like shoving it open, sometimes you can see those threads. So I would stick with a neutral color, but if like all your colors are really dark, maybe go with like a gray thread.
Okay, absolutely. Um, and as a follow up to the Kona card that we were just talking about, Terry asked, "How did you get the Kona card?"
There's a lot of online shops that actually carry them. I think I may have got mine from stashfabrics.com. I think Fabric Bub has it also. That quarter shop might have one. So just look at your favorite online shop and see if they have it. Your local shop might also have it too, if
Okay.
they're open.
Okay, so you could probably even do a Google search for
Hmm.
Kona fabric card and find some links.
Yeah.
Probably. Okay, great. So if anybody else has any questions about the project or about quilting in general, please do send them in, and use the link below the video to sign up for the Quilt Block Challenge and start getting your material requirements and instructions. Um, so for this quilt, how many different blocks are there?
So there's 4 different main blocks. So
Okay.
we have week 1, we're going to do a small block number 1. Week 2 is small block number 2. Week 3, we're going to do the mountain block, which is this one, which you can't see there. And then week 4, we're going to do this large star block. And then week 5, we're going to do the borders and quilt assembly. So this is a really quick quilt along, and you guys will have a quilt by October, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know for some beginner quilters, they might see this quilt and be like, "Oh, I don't know if I could do that." But you break it down into manageable bite-sized
Mhm.
chunks. So, you just take it one step at a time and build upon what you did the last week, and pretty soon, voila, you have a quilt. But what would you say is the most difficult part of this quilt? Would it be the flying geese that you mentioned earlier?
I think so because I use the 4 at one time method for most of the flying geese. Um, For the mountain block, you will use 4 at a time and 1 at a time just because there's 6 of some of the combos. And I don't like making extra geese. So I'll do the 4 at one time and then I'll make a couple 1 at one time. Those are probably the most difficult just because if you don't use a scant 4th inch seam when you're making that, your flying geese might end up too small. So you
Mhm.
really want to test out your machine to make sure you're doing that 4th inch scant seam, and I'll go over those 4 at one time flying geese that very first week. So we'll go from easiest block basically to harder, so that you can build upon your skills. But I'm sure everybody's going to do a great job.
Absolutely. So, in addition to the flying geese and some other piecing techniques, what can people who sign up for this challenge expect to learn from doing this quilt and following along?
Um, I guess I'll learn, yeah, flying geese, and there's also the square and square, which a lot of people haven't done before too.
And
Um,
that's the square and then the little diamond kind of
yes,
inside of
I don't know, maybe it's a diamond in a square.
it.
I'm a self-taught quilter, so I don't have all the terminology
Mhm.
correct. Um, and just getting your blocks the correct size too. I
Yeah.
like to measure my pieces after each step. So you add
Okay.
a piece of fabric to one piece, you're going to measure it to make sure it ended up correctly. And that way your blocks will end up correctly and pressing correctly instead of like too much motion can make your blocks wonky. Um,
Mhm.
I think, you'll be able to build upon your skills. And if you're an advanced quilter and you're like, this quilt's going to be a breeze, that's cool. You can have an easy project and, have a beautiful quilt in the end without a lot of stress too.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the tips and tricks for doing something is just as important as the technique. So, your tips for how to press so that you don't see the thread in between the squares. That's not something that, all people might think of. So that's a great, those tips and tricks are kind of important and, really cool to learn. It can help make everything, flow a lot smoother. So that's awesome. We have a question from Patricia. She asks, what size and type of needle do you use?
I think I use a universal needle. I think it's like what, 9014. It's not like the super heavy duty. When I do quilt, sometimes I'll use the more heavy duty, but I'll
Mhm.
just use a universal needle.
Okay. And what kind of thread do you use? Is it 100% cotton or all purpose?
Yeah, I use 100% cotton just because all the material I'm using is 100% cotton. And so I like to use 100% cotton thread as well. I don't know if this is true, but I heard sometimes if your thread is stronger than your fabric, instead of the seam popping, sometimes your fabric might rip instead of the seam. So
Right.
it's nice to have all the same fabrics and
Okay.
content.
Right, absolutely. Matching the fiber content within a project. I always do that too for garments, but it's
Mhm.
true for quilts as well. Um, we get instructions on this quilt block challenge for each block and piecing everything together and finishing up doing the backing and the border and quilting as well. Is that right? Is
Yes.
the
So
quilting of
the first 4 weeks you'll get the blocks, and then that last week you'll get instructions how to add your borders. And if you don't want to do borders, that's fine too. You'll just skip to the it kind of gives a brief summary of how to sandwich your quilt, how to quilt your quilt, and then I can do a video for that as well, just kind of give you tips on what I like to do, um, and binding, all that. Just so
Okay.
if you are a beginner and you don't know how to finish your quilt, you won't be like left in the lurch, like I have all these blocks, what am I supposed to do with them?
Right. Awesome. So it's start to finish, absolutely everything, all the instructions you need to know to finish your quilt and everything. That's awesome. I have another question about stitching. Mary asks, what stitch length do you recommend? So do you do a default? Do you do a little bit longer, a little shorter?
When I'm piecing, I usually do two, stitch length two. But then when I go to quilt, I bump it up to three, just because I
Okay.
like the stitches to be a little bit longer when I'm quilting.
Okay. And how often do you find you have to change your needle when you're quilting? Does the needle dull maybe faster when you're quilting through batting layers?
I usually will put a fresh needle on right before I start quilting a quilt, just so that I know, because a long time ago I didn't, and it actually like snagged the fabric when I was quilting it, and I was like, oh, I should have changed my needle. So it's good to just put a fresh needle on there right before you quilt it, and it should last you the whole quilt, even like after.
Okay, great. Now we were talking a little bit about finishing and borders. Judy asks, could you use a ditzy for the border? And I am not a quilter, so that term is new to me, Andrea.
Me too. I don't know what
Is
it
it?
is.
Okay, if any viewers
Yeah,
know what that is, you can go ahead and type it into the chat box because
that's
I
interesting.
Ashley keeps trying to get me to quilt, and this I might follow along with this quilt block
Yeah.
challenge because it looks
Oh,
super fun. But I know I need to dip my toes into the quilting waters more. So sorry, Judy, we can't really answer that right now, but maybe in the Facebook group you can talk about it with other people who are doing the challenge and get advice from the community as well. Um, there is another question here. Linda asks, is the entire quilt pictured behind you? What size is it? So uh,
this
that's
one.
not the entire quilt.
No, so it goes above and below me. So the entire quilt with the borders is 60 by 76. If you don't want the borders on it, it would be 48 by 64.
Okay.
So 60 by 76 is like a good throw size quilt for like your couch. It might be a little too small for a bed.
Okay. Okay, great. And we got an answer to our question already. Ditzy is the name for a fabric with small flowers like little daisies.
Oh, that would be
So
really cute for the border.
I think so too. Yeah, I would definitely do that because I'm one for patterned
Mhm.
fabric too, and I love throwing little patterns in. So yeah, I think I would definitely do that for sure. Um, Janice asks also, is there anything we should be doing before the 7th? So before the instructions start coming in, what do you think people should do to prepare for the challenge?
You should join the challenge and download your fabric requirements and pick out your fabrics. If you want, you could iron all your fabrics just so they're all ready to be cut on the 7th. That's really all you need to do.
So iron your fabrics. Now I have a question. Should people wash their fabrics before starting? So when you buy the fabric from the store, do you recommend pre-washing it?
Um, I don't pre-wash my fabrics. I used to, but I noticed when you don't pre-wash your fabrics, they're a little stiffer and easier to cut and stuff. But if you do want to pre-wash, that's fine. You could also use a starch before you cut um, when you're ironing it after, but definitely iron it because any of those creases and folds, you're going to want those to be flat before you're cutting. But if you're buying pre-cuts like fat quarters, you're probably not going to want to wash those because then you use a little bit of yardage if it frays at all. It
Right.
also shrinks too when you wash it. So if you like washing your fabric, you may want to purchase a tiny bit extra than I list, maybe a fourth or eighth more, just to account for any shrinkage or fraying.
Definitely. That's good advice. Um, let's see. Now, I had a question about batting. So, what type of, and this might be in the materials list that you get when you sign up, but what batting do you use for this quilt and why do you like it?
I like using cotton batting. I've been using the Warm Company's Warm and Plush. I used to use the Warm and Natural and the Warm and White a lot, but lately I've been getting the Warm and Plush just because it's a little thicker. So if you're in a colder climate, like Washington gets cold in the winter, so it's a little thicker and a little poofier than a, a standard cotton.
Okay, great. Now, talking about materials and supplies that you might need to gather up before this challenge starts, is there any certain type of ruler that you like to use? Do you have just a rectangular ruler, or do you do, the small square rulers?
If you have small square rulers, they would be helpful. I have the 6 by 24, which is good for cutting your yardage. And then I use this a 6.5 by 6.5 square a lot when I'm like drawing my lines for my flying geese or for just trimming up smaller pieces. That's nice, but it's not necessary. So, like if you're a beginner and all you have is that 6 by 24, that's totally fine. But more rulers are helpful, but they're not necessary.
Okay. So really you don't need anything special. Just
No.
you use that coloring sheet to figure out what color fabric you want, pull from your stash, and just whatever ruler you have, you're going to be good to go. So that's good. You don't need, you don't need anything special. You can really just dive right in. So that is awesome. We have a question from Jenna. She's wondering, what machine do you use? Because she needs a new one.
I actually use a Janome. It's just a heavy duty machine. It's not a fancy quilting machine. When I do end up buying another machine, it'll probably be more quilting friendly. I bought this because I was making a lot of pot holders, which heavy duty, you're going through lots of layers. But there's a lot of good machines out there. I would definitely, if you're able to go into a quilting machine shop, test it out and see which ones you like. And they would probably have good recommendations too, since they deal with all sorts of machines.
Yeah. Yep. And it definitely depends on what you want from a machine. Like
Hmm.
there's machines for absolutely every type of sewing. So depending on if you want to start making bigger quilts, they make some machines that have a bigger space
Hmm.
between, the arm and the bed. And I know it might be hard now to go into a shop and test it out, but I always recommend that as well, to actually go sit at a machine and feel it out. That's the best way to, get a feel for the machine and see if it's something that you would like. But also reading reviews is a great way, either on the machine company's website or on other retailers. Sometimes people will write reviews, which are super helpful. So also, if you ever buy a machine online, do write a review, because it is super helpful for other people who are wanting to, shopping around for a machine. So we have a question about the finished size of the blocks. So what are the finished size of the blocks? And are there two different sizes of blocks?
Yes. So the small blocks on the top and the bottom, their finished size is 8 inches, unfinished is 8.5 inches. And then the large blocks, finished side is 16 inches, unfinished is 16.5 inches.
Okay. And that's all, that information is included in the instructions.
Yes.
When you sign up for the challenge, you'll get all of that information. So it's all going to be written down, so you don't have to remember exactly everything that we're saying, because you'll get all of that information when you sign up. And again, I do want to let people know that the link to sign up should be below the video if you're watching on the National Quilter Circle website, or if you're on Facebook or YouTube, it should be in the description of the video. And links for that Facebook group we were talking about, so you can connect with the community and get more advice and inspiration, see other people's pictures. A link for that Facebook group should be in the comments somewhere. Um, and if your preferred social media platform is Instagram, you can share your progress on the quilt using the hashtag NQC Quilt Block Challenge. So you can see other people's quilts as well and share your progress and get involved in that community as well. Um, and I have a comment here. I am so excited for the challenge. I'm brand new quilter, so that's great. We're getting some new people starting in with the challenge. She's wondering, are there any newbie quilting tips in general you could give me? And I'm interested in this as well.
Um, don't stress out if it's not perfect, because I look back at my first quilt and it's definitely not perfect, and you can't compare yourself to quilters that are experienced, because they've been doing it for years, and it takes a while. It's a very learning process, but just enjoy it. It'll be something you look back on in the future and say, that was my first quilt, it was so much fun, and don't like give up because things might be a little hard. Just try again.
Yeah, and like any skill, it just takes practice. So this first quilt that you're doing, even if it's not perfect, it will help you build on your skills for the next one. And all experience is good and valid, even if you're, cursing and pulling out seams. It's all good experience that allows you to grow your skills. So I love that. And I love that this quilt is so accessible for people who are brand new to it. And I was just wondering about cutting out fabric. Do you use a rotary cutter or scissors?
A rotary cutter. So I'll use my large 6x24 acrylic ruler with a rotary cutter and a mat. Um, I mostly use the dimensions on my ruler. If pieces are really large and you don't have a ruler that big, you can use the lines on your mat.
Okay.
But be consistent with the ruler, because if you have two different brand rulers, they might not be perfectly the same. And so your pieces might not end up the same.
Okay. Right. Just like in manufacturing or in
Mhm.
printing, the lines, sometimes things get a little bit off. So, do you ever like draw your lines on the fabric, or do you just lay your ruler down and cut with your rotary cutter on the edge of the ruler?
Yeah, I just lay it down and cut. Press really hard and cut. I don't have, there's some rulers that have non slip on them, which,
Hmm.
so it won't slide around. But you got to be careful that since it is a long ruler, you got to be careful that it doesn't slide around when you're cutting it.
Right. When you're like pressing on the first
Mhm.
part of the ruler, make sure that the
Yeah.
upper part isn't like
So I
sliding
kind of
around.
move my hand, cut like that.
Right. Yeah. I have a question here from Lynn. We talked a little bit about pre-cuts earlier, but she's wondering, can you use pre-cuts for this pattern?
You may be able to use fat quarters. You can't use jelly rolls because obviously a lot of the pieces are way bigger than a jelly roll. But fat quarters might be a good option if that's something you have in your stash and you want to use it.
Okay. Awesome. Um, Now going back a little bit to the inspiration for the quilt and in your designing of the quilt. So what made you want to use these shapes or this technique and forming it all together? Is it just like a product of what shapes you wanted in the quilt and like how you wanted it to be laid out and the finished look of it, or was it like a conscious choice of, oh, I want this technique in this quilt, or did it go from design down or from technique to design? You know what I mean?
Usually I will draw out shapes first and then so I drew out the stars and then I just kind of mirrored it. I typically will go with a 16-inch block. That's my favorite.
Mhm.
I don't like cutting pieces smaller than 2.5 inches. So
Yes.
I try to base my quilts off of 2 inches. So sometimes like 2 to 3 inches. So that's one of my main goals. And then this one, since it's only 3 wide and it's only 48 inches, just the design, I like my throw sizes to be at least 60 inches wide. So that's why I ended up adding the border to it. And I just kind of like the look of just 3 stars. But if you
Mhm.
were wanting to expand and make it a twin, it'd be obviously wider and longer. Um, but I don't know. I just kind of, draw and go from one little design.
Yeah. Nice. I'm always interested in the design process because that's always my favorite part of a project is designing it and figuring out how all the pieces are going to go together. So yeah, you mentioned if you wanted to make it bigger, adding more stars to just make it wider. Would you recommend adding just one more star to make it 4 stars across, or would it be? I feel like it might be just more pleasing to the eye to have 5 across because I feel like that's sort of one of the
Yeah.
rules of design is odd numbers are kind of it's just more fun to look at, maybe.
It's hard because to stick with the same size block. So if you wanted the twin, if you're doing the same size borders for a twin to be 70, it'd be 76 by 92. You would
Mhm.
basically add one more block, and then I think I actually suggested 2 rows of the large stars. So if you go into that Facebook group, I show basically to get that certain dimension, you have
Right.
to add a certain amount of blocks. So yeah, it would look better to have 5. That I think 5 is a queen size.
Okay.
Queen size would be 5, and then you would have to add 2 rows of stars and then 2 rows of the small stars too. It's
Okay.
kind of hard when it's a set design like this to enlarge with it being
Right.
you'd have to make your blocks larger to make the overall design larger. So it might be easier just to add blocks or to
Right.
make it larger.
To add on to the sides. Right. That makes sense. Um, so Ray is asking, is the full supply list available already? So the full supply list should be available when you sign up using that link. Is that right?
Yes. So when you enter the join page, you put in your email, click join, and then another page will pop up. You can click at the top, it says download, and you click the download button. That's how you can download the PDF.
Okay, so for people who are just joining up, when you join, you get the full supply list.
Hmm.
And do you get instructions for week one, the first block yet? Or is that
No.
going
So you'll get the supply list, you'll get basic instructions, just kind of like, okay, you need to know these things. and then you'll get the coloring sheet and the cover photo. But you'll
Okay.
get those first block instructions on September 7th. And so you'll
Okay.
get a little email from National Quilter Circle on the 7th saying, hey, the block's ready. Go make it.
Awesome. That's great. And it looks like on the Facebook group, people are already talking about fabric choices and sharing their colors and everything. So that's also a good place to go to get inspiration for people who are just joining up and wondering what colors they're going to do and how they're going to combine it in their quilt. So definitely join that Facebook group. It's a really valuable source of inspiration, advice, information, and also just to connect the community. And definitely do use that link below the video to sign up. It's going to be super fun. And Andrea will be there on the Facebook group with you every step of the way to help you along. And at the end of the challenge, you'll have this beautiful Starlight Mountains quilt that you see behind Andrea. So it's going to be a really fun challenge. I hope everyone joins and shares their progress either on the Facebook group or on Instagram. This is going to be super cool. So, Andrea, thank you very much for designing this beautiful quilt and for being here today to answer all our questions and get it kicked off. Thank you again.
Thank you guys for inviting me again. It's a lot of fun
Absolutely.
quilting along with this group.
Absolutely. And thank you all for watching. And we will hopefully see you on the Facebook page. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.